Good morning. Welcome to our morning worship service. Let's take a hymnal, please, and turn to number 438. Excuse me, 438, and we'll stand together as we sing, Jesus Saves, Jesus Saves. 438. We have heard the joyful sound of Jesus saves, Jesus saves, when the tide is all around. Jesus saves, Jesus saves, bear the news to every land, climb the steeps and cross the waves, is our Lord's command. Jesus saves, Jesus saves, wafted on the rolling tide. Jesus saves, Jesus saves, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing ye islands of the sea, echo back the ocean caves, earth shall keep its jubilee. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing above the battle strife, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. By his death and endless life, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing it softly in the moon, when the heart for mercy prays. Sing in triumph for the tomb. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Give the wind a mighty voice. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Nations will rejoice. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. And shout salvation, the song of victory. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. You may be seated.
All right, just got a few announcements, and before we get into the rest of the service today, just want to remind everybody we've got our missions conference this week, and so the missionaries are actually going to be coming in sometime tomorrow, and so we want to pray for them, pray that they'll have safe travels up here, and that we'll be praying that God will work in their lives and provide all the support that they need. They're going to be here with us for about a week, but our missions conference is going to start February the 1st, so Wednesday night, and we're going to have a Wednesday night service, a Thursday night service, and a Friday night service, and then Saturday we're having our banquet. And so be sure to put that on your calendars. Make sure you're planning on being here. That's going to be at 7 o'clock each night. With that, on the 3rd, we've got the Walkers. They're having their vow renewals on the 3rd. And so that's going to be that Friday night, and that's at 5 o'clock. And so we're going to have their vow renewal, and then about 2 hours later, we'll come back and do our missions conference for that. So make sure you're here for that, for both of those services. We want to be there to support them for that. And then next Sunday, we'll be closing out the missions conference, and so we'll want to be here for that as well. At the end of the month, on the 4th Saturday of every month, and I'm going to mention this again tonight when we go over our calendar for the year and kind of go over our vision for the year, we're going to be having on the 4th Saturday of every month, starting yesterday, but starting this coming February 25th, we're going to have a men's prayer breakfast at 9 o'clock. And so we had one yesterday. We're going to be doing another one in February, and we're going to be doing that every month for the rest of the year, Lord willing. And then we got our homecoming coming up. So make sure you're keeping an eye on the bulletin in the back there, and then the calendar that you got earlier in the year as well. And one more announcement, and then we'll open in the word of prayer. Just want to remind everybody, if you can, please be here tonight. Tonight we're going to be looking at really the vision that I believe God has for our church this year, and that really, I'll go ahead and just tell you right now, it's those banners on the wall up there, win the lost at any cost. I think that we as Christians, and really we as a church at Faith Baptist Church, I think we need to be a soul-winning church. We need to be a church that is willing to win the lost no matter what the cost. Whatever the cost may be to us, whether that's financial or whether that's our time, whether that's our resources, whether that's our talents that God has given us, I think we need to be willing to win the lost at any cost. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So please be here tonight as we look at that and what some of the things that we're going to do in order to accomplish that. And so hopefully you'll be here tonight at 5 o'clock for that. Let's go ahead and open in a word of prayer, and then we'll continue on with the song service. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for this day that you've given us. Lord, I pray that you would give us a good night tonight. Lord, I pray that you give us a good morning as well, Lord, that you would work in the service, God, that you would speak to hearts, Lord, that you would teach us something, Lord, that we can apply to our lives, Lord, and that we would be profitable servants here in your house, Lord. We thank you and praise you for all that you've done. In Jesus' name, amen.
You have your hymnals open. It's right across on the other side, number 437. Call comes ringing o'er the restless waves. Send the light. Send the light. There's a call comes ringing o'er the restless waves. Send the light. Send the light. There are souls to rescue. There are souls to save. Send the light. Send the light. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine forevermore. We have heard the Macedonian call today. Send the light, send the light, and the golden offering at the cross we lay. Send the light, send the light, send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine forevermore. Let us pray that grace may everywhere be found. Let the light, send the light, and the Christ-like spirit everywhere be found. Send the light, send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine forevermore. Let us not grow weary in the work of love. Send the light, send the light. Let us gather jewels for a crown above. Send the light, send the light, send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine from shore to shore. Send the light, the blessed gospel light, let it shine forevermore. I do have my grandson Jesse, who's playing along on his French horn as we sing today, and appreciate that. Now the quartet's going to sing. The quartet's going to sing. You're going to take a break.
For a long time I traveled down a long, lonely road. My heart was so heavy, in sin I sank low. Then I heard about Jesus, what a wonderful hour. I'm so glad that I found out He would bring me out through His saving power. Thank God I am free, free, free from this world of sin. Washed in the blood of Jesus, I've been born again. Hallelujah, I'm saved, saved, saved by His wonderful grace. I'm so glad that I found out He would bring me out and show me the way.
of prison that's taking its flight, like the blind man that God gave back his sight, like the poor wretched beggar that's found fortune and fame. I'm so glad that I found out he would bring me out to his holy name. Thank God I am free,
free, free from this world of sin. Been washed in the blood of Jesus, I've been born again.
Hallelujah, I'm
Saved, saved, saved by His wonderful grace. I'm so glad that I found out He would bring me out and show me the way. Thank God I am free, free, free from this world of sin. Washed in the blood of Jesus, I've been born again.
Hallelujah, I'm
Saved, saved, saved by His wonderful grace. I'm so glad that I found out He would bring me out and show me the way. I'm so glad that I found out He would bring me out and show me the way.
$441. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, snatch them in pity from sin and the grave. Weep for the erring one, lift up the fallen, tell them of Jesus the mighty to save. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying, Jesus merciful, Jesus will save. Though they're sliding in, still He is waiting, waiting the talented child to receive. Plead with Him earnestly, plead with Him gently. He will forgive if they only believe. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus will save. Down in the human heart, crushed by the tempter, feelings like Mary that grace can restore. Touched by a loving arm, lengthened by kindness, cords that are broken will vibrate once more. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful. Jesus will save. Rescue the perishing, duty demanding. Drink for thy labor, the Lord will provide. Back to the narrow lane, patiently lend them. Tell the person their Savior has died. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. Jesus is merciful. Jesus will save.
Alrighty, at this time we're going to go ahead and pray over the offering. So let's go ahead and bow our heads and pray. Lord, I thank you so much for this day that you've given us, God. I pray that you would be with us this morning, Lord, as we look in your word. I pray that you would be with the offering that we take up this morning, Lord, that you would use it for your honor and glory, Lord. I pray that you would be with this special singing that's going to go on as well, Lord. I pray that you would continue to bless it, Lord. I pray that you would bless this church, Lord, and bless us this year, Lord, as we look at what we're going to be doing out this coming night, Lord, as we come back tonight and look at all the things we're going to be doing this year, Lord. I pray that you would provide the funds, provide the laborers, Lord, and provide the motivation, God, that we would want to see souls saved, Lord, or no matter what the cost. We thank you and praise you for all that you've done. Now be with us again the rest of this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
One of the joys of being a Christian is to be able to sing that you have blessed assurance that Jesus is yours. Blessed assurance.
I can tell of a story when the good were fed, when he lifted the sick, when he raised up the dead. I could say of the others, like the blind man to see, but I'd rather just tell you what's happened to me.
I'm saved to the uttermost, and I know that I am washed in the blood of the precious Lamb. Through the Father, through the Son, through the Holy Ghost, I'm saved to the uttermost. You must be forgiven to make heaven your home. The good life you're living won't do it alone. So just trust in the Savior, He'll save you today. And with blessed assurance, you too can say, I'm saved to the uttermost, and I know that I am washed in the blood of the precious Lamb. To the Father through the Son, through the Holy Ghost, I'm saved to the uttermost. I'm saved to the uttermost, and I know that I am washed in the blood of the precious Lamb. Through the Father, through the Son, through the Holy Ghost, I'm saved through the uttermost. Through the Father, through the Son, through the Holy Ghost, I'm saved to the uttermost.
All right, we're going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 today. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Last week we looked at a cheerful giver. And I had mentioned that when it comes to preaching about money, preaching about giving, it's not something that a lot of people like to preach about, or some people like to preach about it too much. And so it's not, I will say right off the bat, it's not something I'm really comfortable preaching about, but we've got a missions conference coming up. We're going to be doing Faith Promise Missions, and I thought it expedient to kind of talk a little bit about why we give, what we give, and how we give. And one of the things we're going to be looking at today really is how we give. And last week we looked at how we give as far as the cheerfulness of it. Today we're going to be looking about faithful giving. But I want to kind of point out the beginning of 2 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul was kind of dealing with, I think, the same issue that I kind of deal with. We have a church, it's a small church, but our church is very faithful in their giving. And I just want to say that right off the bat. We were talking about that a little bit yesterday, how our church is small, but we are able to support so many missionaries, and we were able to give so much money and be able to fulfill such a large budget. I kind of feel like Paul here in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 1, for touching the ministering of the saints, it is superfluous for me to write unto you. In other words, what he's saying is, when it comes to ministering to the church, it's almost like I don't really feel like I need to talk to you guys about it. I feel like it's too much. Like I don't need to talk to you guys about all this. But he wanted to talk to them about it because he had been bragging to other people about them. He says in verse number 2, "For I know the forwardness of your minds, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia and Achaia, and was ready a year ago, and your zeal had provoked many, very many. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that as I said, ye may be ready." He's saying that, I'm writing all this to you not because I think you guys need to know how to give. You guys already know how to give. I'm writing all these things because basically I've been bragging about you, and I don't want the people to come up and find out that I've been bragging on you, and then you don't even fulfill what I've been bragging on you about. And so he's trying to exhort them. But I do want to get to verse number 7. Verse number 7 is where we're going to spend a lot of the time, and then we're going to go over to Matthew 24, because I think that's a very applicable passage of Scripture. I'm sorry, Matthew 25. But verse number 7, it says, "Every man according as he hath purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver." And again, I kind of mentioned that I feel like this church, I don't know that I even need to talk too much about giving. I do think it's important that we talk about that every once in a while. But tonight we're going to be looking at our vision for the year. Tonight we're going to be talking about what is Faith Baptist Church going to do in this community to try and reach our goal of winning the lost at any cost. And we're going to be looking at a lot of different things that we're going to be doing. We're going to be starting a children's ministry on Wednesday nights. We're going to be starting a bunch of different things. We're going to have camp going on this summer. In fact, I've got to print out some forms tonight for that. We've got kids going to camp. We're hoping to get more kids going to camp. We've got a bunch of different things we're going to be doing. But what all that requires is not just money. It does require money. But more so than that, I think it requires sacrifice. And a lot of times when we think about sacrifice, we think about monetary sacrifice. You know, we think about, I've got to give up so much money for the church, but I think it's a little bit more than that. And when he says here that every man according as he hath purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver, he's specifically talking about money there. He is talking about giving money, and he's talking about purposing in your heart. You've made a commitment in your heart. I'm going to give so much to the church. I'm going to give so much to God's work, and I'm going to do so cheerfully. I'm not doing so because somebody's twisting my arm and telling me I need to do it. I'm doing it because I want to, and I'm doing it with a cheerful heart. But I think this same principle could be applied to service. Because when we think about money, as we talked about last week, when it comes to being a cheerful giver, last week we focused on the biggest reason we can give cheerfully is because we recognize it doesn't belong to us in the first place. The reason I can give cheerfully to the church, the reason I can give cheerfully to missionaries is not because it's fun to give away my money, because it's not fun to give away my money, but I can do it because I recognize it's not my money I'm giving away. It's somebody else's. And I think that one of the things I want to look at today is that not only our money should be given faithfully, but really our time, our efforts, our talents, our abilities, we ought to be willing to give ourselves faithfully. Now, this giving that he's talking about, this monetary giving, is something that he wants us to do so faithfully. He says that as you've purposed in your heart, so let him give. He's talking about a faithful gift. He's talking about somebody who is going to say something and he's going to keep his word. He's going to be faithful to that. He is going to not hold back what he said he's going to give. He's going to actually give it. He's going to be faithful with that. And again, I think that that's true with our lives as well. And he goes on in verse number 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, that ye always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. He's saying the reason we can do all that is because he is faithful. He is faithful. But even before that, I'm kind of skipping ahead of myself. Let's look at verse number 6. It says, But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. And he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Now, there are a lot of people who will take this passage and say, well, you see, this passage says that if you give to the Lord bountifully, then God's going to give you bountifully. So if I give $10 to the Lord, I'm going to get $100 back. Well, that's not really what he's talking about. Yeah, and you find that later on. You find that in the last part of the verse. We're going to look at that when we get to the end here today. But what he's talking about is, we can't expect to reap from God. We can't expect to reap blessings from God. And I don't think these blessings are monetary blessings. I think they're spiritual blessings, as we're going to see in verses 13 through 15 specifically. We're going to see that the blessings that we receive are not monetary blessings. But if we want to receive any kind of blessing from God, we've got to sow bountifully. If I want to harvest a bunch of grain, if I want to harvest a bunch of corn, we're going to be working on our garden sometime if I can ever get a chance to get out in our yard. We try and do a garden every year because I've got 6 kids, and trying to buy vegetables, trying to buy groceries and things like that with today's prices is pretty ridiculous. And so we try and raise our own vegetables as best as we can. Last year we didn't do very well. And it was because we didn't take the time to work the ground. We had just gotten here. We didn't get a chance to fertilize the ground. We didn't get a chance to do what we needed in order to do so. But when we sow, we expect to get more than we sow in the ground. When I put 1 grain of corn into the ground, I expect to get a plant that's going to produce at least 1, maybe 2 years. And I expect to get more than what I put into it. And when it comes to the work of God, what we put into it, we should expect to get more out of it. And I don't think that he's talking about money here. I think if I am investing in a soul, I am expecting God to give an increase in that. If I am investing in souls for Christ, when we are winning the lost at any cost, as I am teaching somebody and preaching the gospel to somebody, I expect that person to get saved. And after they get saved, I expect them to go out and win more souls. I expect not just to get that one person saved, I expect multiple people to get saved as a result of that, because I'm going to lead somebody to the Lord. That person's going to get a burden for God, and he's going to go lead somebody to the Lord. That person's going to get a burden for God, and he's going to go lead somebody to the Lord. There's going to be a bountiful harvest from that one sowing. And when it comes to the church, when it comes to the things that we do in our church, we give money to the church, we give time to the church, and as we give that money to the church, we ought to be expecting God to do something with that. We ought to expect God to do something with that. I think it would be wrong of us as leadership in the church, it would be wrong as me as a pastor of the church to take y'all's money, to take y'all's time, and then not do anything with it. Now, that would be wrong. I'd probably get fired. I'd probably get kicked out of the church because I'm not doing anything with what was given. When the church people give to the church, they expect the pastor to be doing something, but I don't think it should all just fall on the pastor. Now, we were talking in Sunday school, I think one of the biggest problems with church today is we've been looking, and you could talk about problems in churches, and I'm not here to talk about problems in churches, but what I'm saying is we've been looking in 1 Corinthians, and we got to chapter 3 today in Sunday school. And in chapter 3, the first verse opens up with, you're carnal. You're all carnal. You're supposed to be eating meat, but instead you're drinking milk. And I find that this is a problem not just with the Corinthian church, this is a problem with a lot of people, a lot of Christians, is that we expect the pastor to do everything. We expect the pastor to do all these things. We expect the deacons to do all these things. We expect the Sunday school teacher to do all these things. We expect everybody else to do it, but we're not expecting ourselves to do something. And it's because we don't want to grow spiritually ourselves. And when it comes to faithful giving, God is expecting us to be faithful in our sowing. God is expecting us to be faithful in our sowing. It's not just the pastor being faithful in his sowing. He ought to be faithful in his sowing. I ought to be faithful in the sowing that I do. But every church member ought to be faithful in the sowing that they do. And I want to encourage us that as we are looking at all of this, not to look beyond just the monetary giving and look at the giving that we ought to be giving. Let's go to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 7. It says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." And what he's talking about there is, he's talking about if you want to reap spiritual things, you need to be sowing spiritual things. Yes, we ought to be sowing our money. We ought to be giving our money to the church, but we ought to be giving our lives to the church. Now, Romans chapter 12, verse 1, it opens up and says that we ought to present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. It's reasonable for God to ask you to give your life to Him because He owns you. He bought you with a price. And again, so many times we think of being a Christian, we think, because I'm a Christian, I'm free. And yes, I'm free. God has given me a sense of freedom, but that freedom is not freedom, it's liberty. And liberty is a little bit different than freedom in the sense that liberty is freedom within bounds. I have a freedom to do certain things, but God is still wanting me and expecting me to do something. We are all stewards of what God has given us. I was talking in Sunday school this morning, when it comes to a steward, what that's talking about is if I've got a dog, I've got 20 chickens or something like that. I don't even know how many chickens I've got several chickens. And when I go out of town, I got to get somebody to either watch those chickens, or I got to make sure that they have everything they need. I got to put the dog into a boarding house. I got to make sure the chickens got all the feed and everything. But if I'm letting somebody watch my animals, what I'm doing is I'm giving that person freedom in my home. But with that comes an expectation that I'm expecting them to make sure that my dog has food and water, make sure that she gets out to the bathroom so she's not going all over the house, make sure that my animals have all the feed that they need and all the water that they need and that they're taken care of and that nothing's getting to them. I'm expecting that person to do that, but they have freedom in my house. But with that freedom comes that responsibility, and God has left us with some responsibilities. He's given us freedom here in this life, but we still have a responsibility, and that responsibility is that we're supposed to be sowing spiritual things. And if we sow spiritual things, we're going to reap spiritual things. If we spend all of our time sowing worldly things and sowing things that don't amount to anything, then we're going to be like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it talks about how we're going to be saved, but as by fire. Everything's going to burn up. We're going to enter into heaven with nothing to show for it. We've got to make sure that our focus is on things that are spiritual, things that are going to last, things that are going to continue on past this life. And so we need to be faithful in our sowing. We need to be faithful to our commitments. Verse number 7 here, going back to 2 Corinthians 9. 2 Corinthians 9:7, it says, every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give. We ought to be faithful in our commitments. And we do so willingly. It says in verse number 7, it says, every man according as he hath purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. In other words, the things that I give, whether it's giving of my money or giving of my time, I shouldn't have to be twisted. My arm shouldn't have to be twisted to give to God. You know, I as a pastor shouldn't have to twist a church member's arm to get him to volunteer to help out in the church, to get him to come to visitation, to get him to teach in the Sunday school class, to get him to help out around the church, to get him to give their tithe and their offerings. And I shouldn't have to twist their arms, but also you shouldn't have to have your arms twisted. And what I mean by that is we ought to have a love for God that goes beyond what the pastor says and what's expected of us. We're doing it not because we're expected of it, but because we love the person that's going to benefit from it. And it's not going to be me as a pastor, it's going to be God. And if I am doing things for my own benefit, then I'm doing things for the wrong reason. If I as a pastor am trying to get people to work in the church because I want them to do something for me, then I'm doing it with the wrong expectation and I'm doing it with the wrong motivation. What we ought to be doing is we ought to be looking at why do we give? And the reason we ought to give is because we love God, because of what He's given for us. You know, I go back to Romans chapter 12, verse 1, where it says, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. The reason it's reasonable is because God gave all for us. God gave His all for us. He died on the cross for our sins. He gave up His Son. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. God gave up His Son. God gave up His life for us. And all He asks is us to serve Him. He doesn't ask us to die. He doesn't ask us to be separated from God. He asks us to love Him. And then He goes on and He says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And in 1 John, I believe it's chapter 5, He says His commandments aren't grievous. He's not going to ask you to do something that's hard. He's not going to ask you to do something that you can't do. In fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 tells us that there's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. And God is not willing that any should be tempted above that they are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape. God's not going to put on you more than you can handle without making some way out. Now, you may have something in your life that you can't handle, but God's got a way out of it. And God's going to provide a way out of it, and God expects us to be faithful to Him, and He's going to provide for us. And it really comes down to the reason we need to be faithful with our commitments is because God is always faithful to us. God is always faithful to us. I do want to go to Matthew chapter 25. Matthew 25. And in Matthew 25, we see a passage here that Jesus is giving a parable. He's already given several parables about salvation, and He gives this parable about the talents. And most of us have probably heard the parable of the talents. I'm going to read some of this. It says in verse number 14, for the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country who called his servants and delivered unto them his goods. Unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. And what we see here is God gives us according to our ability. God knows what you can handle. God knows what you can't handle. He's only going to give you what you can handle. And so He knows this person with the 5, he could handle 5. This person with the 3, he could handle 3. He knows that the person with the 1 could have handled 1. Of course, you find out that he didn't. And then skip down to verse 20. And so he that received 5 talents came and brought other 5, saying, Lord, thou hast delivered unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside thee 5 more talents. And his Lord said unto him, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over one. Let's skip down to verse 25. talking about the man with the 1 talent, he says he was afraid and went and hid the talent in the earth. Lo, that thou hast, that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gathered where I have not strawed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he that hath abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And what he's talking about there is this guy, he didn't do anything with the money. He buried it. And the master was wrathful about it. He was angry about it because this servant didn't steward his things the way that God wanted him to steward them. He didn't take care of them the way that he should have. He buried them. He should have at least put them into the bank, he's saying, so that he could at least get it with usury, with some interest on it. But instead he didn't do anything with it. And what God is the principle here, he's talking specifically about salvation in this passage, but I think the principle could also apply to us as Christians that we're supposed to be stewards, because the Bible says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2, that it is required of stewards that a man be found faithful. God expects stewards, those who are given something to take care of that thing, God expects them to be faithful in their taking care of it. And the reason that we ought to be willing to do that is because God provides for us. I want to go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. When we don't take care of those things, that parable that we just read tells that there's a consequence. There's an eternal consequence. If God has given you the message of salvation and you reject that salvation, there's an eternal consequence. You're going to end up in hell. And God has given everyone an opportunity. God is going to give everyone an opportunity. And we have a responsibility to take that opportunity and to believe on Jesus Christ. But when it comes to, as Christians, after we've believed on Him, we still have responsibilities that God gives us. And He tells us that we're supposed to be faithful. And here's why. Skipping down to, we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, skipping down to verse 12. For the administration of this service not only supplieth the want of the saints, but it is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God, whilst by this experiment of ministration they glorify God for you, for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men, and by their prayer for you, which long after you for exceeding grace of God in you, thanks be to God for this unspeakable gift. In other words, the blessings that we are going to receive is spiritual blessings. God is faithful to provide spiritual blessings. As we give to Him, God is going to give back to us those spiritual blessings. We may give God $100, and God's not going to give us $1,000. He may give us $1,000, but ultimately, what He promises He's going to give us is blessings. If we give God an hour of our time, we can expect a blessing from God. We can expect that God is going to take that time and God is going to multiply it. Whether it's through us or to somebody else, God is going to use that time and He's going to allow it to be for His glory as long as we're giving it to Him. In other words, if we give something to God, we can expect that God is going to use it. And we need to be willing to give things to God. You know, he says in verse number 13 that this is an experiment. And it's interesting that he uses that word experiment. It's basically the word test. And as we test, it says, whilst by the test, or by the experiment of this ministration, they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men. In other words, as you test God by giving your money, these people are seeing this liberal distribution that you are giving, and they see that you are subjected unto God's glory, and they're going to glorify God as a result of it. As you give, other people are going to see you giving. As you give of your time, if you give of your money, other people are going to see that, and they're going to glorify God about that. And that's the blessing that we receive, is the glorification of God. Because ultimately, that is what we ought to be serving for. We ought to be serving not for ourselves, but serving for God. The Bible says that when we get into heaven, we're going to be casting our crowns at His feet. And you know, when I was growing up, I heard that all the time growing up, and I never really understood what that meant. I always thought, you know, why in the world would I work for a reward and then just throw it at Jesus' feet? Why am I not keeping all these rewards? And ultimately, as I grew up, I began to realize why that is, especially when I fell in love. And I fell in love with my wife. the woman who is now my wife. And I fell in love with her, and I realized I just want to give her everything. I just want to work for her. I want her to be happy. I want to see her smile. I want to see her happy. I want to see the joy on her face. Now I've got kids. And I want to see them happy. We got to take them to basketball yesterday. And I love seeing my kids smile. I love seeing my kids have fun. And I just want to give the world to my kids. And one of my favorite things right now is our little 2-year-old girl, Johanna. She runs around, and now her new thing that I absolutely love, and it just about kills me every time she does it. She'll walk around the house saying, "I love you, Daddy. I love you, Daddy." I love that. That's probably the greatest thing in the world, and I would give the world for her. And now I kind of understand, as I am working and serving for God, the reason I'm casting my crowns at his feet at the end is because I am doing all these things not for me. I'm not giving to the church because I want some kind of recognition that I'm giving these things to the church. You know, when we pass out the Faith Promise missions cards at the end in next week when we do the missions conference, when we pass those things out, there's no name on those things. And the reason there's no name on there is because, for one, I don't want to know who's given what. I don't want to know. I don't want that responsibility. But for another, it's because we're not doing it for our glory. We're doing it for God. And as I am doing all of these things for God, I am laying up crowns. I'm laying up rewards, not for myself. I'm doing all this so that when I see God, I can say, "Lord, look what I did for you. Lord, I did all these things for you. I want you to be happy, and I want to see you happy. I want to see you glorified. I want to see all the glorification of you as I have sacrificed my life for you, and I've given myself over to this children's ministry that I've been working on, and I've been trying to help these kids learn about your scriptures, and I've been trying to help out in the door-to-door ministry that we've got going on, and I've been trying to get souls saved, and I've been working in the church to clean it, to make sure that everybody comes and they see that everything is nice and neat, and I'm trying to make sure that we've got everything going on in the church and make sure that we've got the funds in order to support the building so that people come in and they see a nicely kept place. And I'm doing all of these things. I'm not doing these things for my glory. I'm doing these things because I want people to glorify God. And as I'm glorifying God, that's the crowns that I'm casting at his feet, saying, "Lord, look what I've done for you. Not for my sake, but because I love you. Because of what you did for me. You died on the cross for my sins. It's my reasonable service. It's only reasonable that I give my life for you, and it's only reasonable that I offer all of these things for you because of what you've done for me." The reason I'm able to give faithfully, the reason I'm able to be a faithful giver and keep my word when it comes to when I make a profession that I'm going to give this much to God, I ought to keep my word, not because the church is going to hold you accountable, and I will make a pledge to you that this church, if you make a Faith Promise Missions, nobody in this church is ever going to hold you accountable for that. And it's not because I want to make sure that we don't get the money for our missions. It's because it's not on me. It's about God's. It's about a profession that you are making, not to the church. You're making that a profession to God. And as we make that profession to God, God is the one who's going to hold us accountable, and I'm doing it not because I want the church to know, not because I want the pastor to know, not because I want the church members to know, not because I want somebody to think that I'm more spiritual because I'm giving, whether it's of my time. I'm not teaching a Sunday school class because I want everybody to see, "Hey, I'm doing more for God than you." No, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I want to see souls glorify God. I want to see God's name glorified. I want to see God's name lifted up. And I want to see more benefits, and I want to see more people in heaven. I want to bring the sheaves with me. Because when I leave this earth, I'm not taking my 401k with me. I'm not taking my Maserati, which I don't know of anybody in this room that has a Maserati. I'm not taking my sports car with me. I'm not taking any of those things with me. There aren't any U-Hauls going to heaven. What I'm taking with me are the souls. What I'm taking with me is the relationship that I have grown with Christ. And as I have built that relationship up with Christ, and as I have won souls for Christ, that's what I get to take with me. And that's where I get to cast my crowns at his feet and say, "Look what I did for you, Lord. I did all these things because I could never repay you, but what I can do, I want to do that because I love you." And I hope and pray that we would be faithful in our giving because of what he's done for us. God has always been faithful to us. Now, we could go through the scriptures, and we don't have time. It's already 50. It's about 10 till. We could go through the scriptures and look at Genesis and how when Adam and Eve sinned, what happened? Did God just give up on them? No. The next phrase is God came looking for them. They were trying to hide themselves. They were trying to hide all the sin, and God came looking for them. One of my favorite passages, Ephesians chapter 2, after it talks about how sinful we were, how we were enemies of Christ, it says, I believe it's in verse number 3 or 4, it says, "But God, who is rich in mercy, with his great love, wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses and sins, hath quickened us together. By grace ye are saved." God did all of that when we weren't looking for him. God has always been faithful to us. You go through the book of Judges, you go through the entire Old Testament, and you see how every time Israel disobeyed God and fell away and they would get thrown into captivity, God was always faithful to send a deliverer. God was always faithful to his children. God was always faithful to bring them back into the land. God was always faithful to help them build the temple. God was always faithful to provide for their needs, their spiritual needs and their physical needs. And throughout history, God has always been faithful. When Jesus came to earth, that was God being faithful and offering us a way out of the predicament that we were in so that we don't have to go to hell. We can go to heaven and be with him in eternity because God was faithful to us. And if God is faithful to us, we ought to be faithful to him. And I hope and pray that as we leave here today, that would be our attitude, is that I'm going to be faithful to God. I am going to keep my word. I'm going to do what I can to see God's kingdom glorified and to see God's kingdom expand. And I'm going to do everything in my power to be faithful to that goal. I'm not going to quit. I'm not going to be unfaithful to that. I'm going to be faithful to God because I love him. We expect our spouses to be faithful to us. We expect our spouses not to cheat on us. But do we expect Christians to be faithful to God? Or do Christians cheat on God? Do Christians look to the world and start looking the other way and seeing this other thing that seems attractive to them? We need to be faithful to God and not be looking at the world and being led astray by the world. We need to be faithful to God and his work and allow him to be the forefront of our minds, be the forefront of our lives, and let him be everything that we are about. I had mentioned, I think on Facebook, and we'll close with this, that I got probably the best compliment that I've ever gotten in my life this week, and that was that somebody had told me, you always bring it back to the book, to that book. You're always talking about that book. And I hope and pray that, and I don't know that I will be faithful to this, but I hope and pray that I will be faithful to this. And I'm going to pledge that I'm going to attempt to be as faithful as I possibly can, that everybody I come in contact would have that kind of testimony about me, that he always goes back to the book. He always goes back to Christ. Because I think that's what as Christians we ought to be doing. We ought to be faithful to God so that everybody can see that guy right there, he believes the Bible. That's all he ever talks about. The Bible says in Joshua 1:8, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth. What he's saying there is, you're always talking about it. It's always in your mouth. You're always talking about God. We ought to be people who are faithful to God in our giving, in our lives, in our talents, in our time. We ought to be faithful to God in every aspect of our life. And God ought to be the forefront of our minds. And I hope and pray that would be our commitment to God this year. As we look at tonight the different things and opportunities that we're going to have here at Faith Baptist Church in Valdosta, as we look at all that tonight, I hope that you would come with a heart that is willing to be faithful to God. And not just faithful in giving, but faithful in giving of your lives for him. Let's go ahead and stand as the piano player comes. We'll have a short time of invitation. And as the piano player comes to play, or whoever's going to be playing the offertory or the invitation, I want us to take just a moment. And as we are focusing in on this year, I hope that each of us would make a commitment, maybe right there in your seats, that you're going to be faithful to God. Not just in your giving, yes, in your giving as well, but in your lives, that you're going to make God the forefront of your life. That we're not going to be led astray by